Well, hello, Amhotep, and welcome. I'm Mog Morgan, companion of Set and Knight of Shambhala, continuing the series of lectures on the topic of the Decans and the demonic calendar and the magic of the sky of ancient Egypt. It's all in there. This is the third part of, or third time in this sequence that we've returned to this thing in a little bit more depth, really, than previously. I think there is another talk on the podcast back on the Decans. I've probably talked about it quite a lot because it's such an important issue. So the Jake Stratton-Kent Memorial Lecture, I kind of introduced some of these ideas at Glastonbury, and I'm just going to kind of go into a little bit more detail about that and kind of show some star maps and all the rest, and introduce people to the quite complicated but fascinating topic of how to tell the time in ancient Egypt, really, especially in a magical context. So as per usual, I'll put the animation on the background of the kind of revolving of the decanal belt as we described last time, which is this series of markers in the sky that were identified by the ancient Egyptians and went through various meanings over time. So last time I talked about the star clocks from the Ramesside, or the tombs of the Ramesses dynasty, and this sort of figure. I kind of mention it again, that in case I didn't sort of emphasize that when people first saw this in the modern times, obviously someone might have seen it in the ancient times as well, but obviously with the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, whatever it was, 1802, and the great expedition of experts and who went to Egypt to document everything, including this person Champollion, who's credited with certainly translating or decoding the hieroglyphs, which up till then had been kind of mostly not really well understood. So it was an ancient language that was kind of lost to us for quite a long time, so at least almost 2,000 years. And he went there as a scientist and looked at an Egyptologist, looked at lots of these things. When he saw this image that I showed last time of this figure, of a kneeling figure, whose background is seen against the backdrop of the stars, of the decanal belt and the other stars, he kind of didn't know. This is something that we've had to kind of discuss. He didn't know, right, the actual use of it at that point, because even though there was a text there, it took a while to translate it and work out what these technical things were. But he kind of speculated that it was related to the Greek medical doctrine of melasthesia, which is a kind of relationship between astrology and parts of the body. Now, this isn't, I'm sure this idea, we can find it in other ways in Egypt. It wasn't actually what this particular drawing was for, this particular image was for, but it was an interesting idea, and it certainly wouldn't have been alien to the way the Egyptians looked at things. They probably came up with that sort of idea itself, and they often did make this relationship between particular deities who would also have a stellar form and particular parts of the body, and also with particular ailments. So it was a bit of a speculation, a guess, if you like, but it wasn't too far off the mark. It was certainly an interesting theory, and would have been another example of a Greek doctrine, this doctrine of melasthesia, which had some sort of Egyptian origins that had been a little bit obscured over the years by the way things had gone. So, as I say, it was an interesting concept, but this particular one is mostly, this object is for the measurement of time at night. most especially, and the equivalent of something that we know of in our own time of the books of magical hours. So that's very interesting too. I think I'll put my headphones on. Okay, so we talked last time about these Ramessid monuments, as I say, and I just gave a little kind of extra thing. This time I'm putting another picture on the screen, which is an image from the tomb of Senenmut. And also I'll show, in relation to that, some images from the temple of Hatshepsut, which is a very, very famous temple in Egypt. It's a kind of much visited, very kind of distinctive look to it, rather than a kind of standalone temple. It has this kind of aspect. There's a lot of those tombs on that wall of at the side of Pyramid Mountain, where they're kind of orientated, or they're towards the eastern horizon, essentially, and would be a very good place to make all sorts of astrological observations. And in fact, the tomb itself has a kind of instrument in it that I think I've mentioned before, or animated before, of the way when the sun rises on certain days of the year, it strikes through the temple, and there's a kind of aperture up in the above the temple, through which focuses the sunlight into a single beam that flows into the innermost bit of the temple and kind of works its way, this ball of light, across the floor and illuminates the particular statues depending on the particular time of year. So that in itself is a kind of astronomical measuring instrument that's very, very interesting to think about. I might kind of see if I can put a link into the little animation I made for that, to see, just in a few seconds you can see it flick through. If not, I'll put it in another talk, because it's a very, very interesting piece of timekeeping in its own right. So there was obviously something about Queen Hatshepsut. It's very, very special in lots and lots of different ways, and certainly in terms of the history of astronomy, religious astronomy, astrology, all these different things apply. Her monuments and also people who work for her play a important role in ways that we couldn't really deal with them all in one lecture of this sort of about 40 minutes or whatever it is. Try to restrict it to that, because there's so many different things that we could talk about and describe in connection with this temple. So it's already going to be a lot if we just look at her relationship with this person, Senenmut, who wasn't the king. He was some sort of vizier, a kind of advisor, a kind of hand, if you like, the person who helped them out, who did the kind of nitty-gritty work. But he was obviously a special person. Initially, he was some sort of tutor as well to some of the children, the Senenmut children, Hatshepsut children, royal children. He was a tutor to tutor them in technical stuff and the stuff you have to learn. And there were all sorts of speculations that there was some relationship between Senenmut and Queen Hatshepsut, which wouldn't have been allowed technically. You know, it would have been a different, across the tracks, as it were, or royal family with a kind of commoner type thing. But they obviously did have some sort of relationship. They're certainly suspected of it. And there's this kind of very, how can you say, secret, or not so secret, open secret way of connecting them together in death as well. So you have this enormous high status mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. And I should say there are speculations that you can actually, in some way or other, if you went through the rock face, if there was a tunnel, of which there are quite a lot of tunnels and tombs, they just found another one, you would, if you went straight through, you would come out in the Valley of the Kings. So if you like, some of the tombs, the long tombs from the Valley of the Kings, could very easily connect with other tombs going the other way. You know, there could be, because it's a labyrinth down there in effect, not all of whose details have been completely discovered. So you've got that aspect to it. But anyway, if you come forward immediately in front of the temple, more or less where the rest house is now, if you go to one side, there's a kind of little quarry. There's not much visited. There's not particularly a lot to see there. It's some sort of quarry, but you can go and see there, and it's quite a distance away. Realistically, you know, it's several hundred meters. There is the entrance to the tomb of Senenmut. And of course, if you think then, the tunnel from that sort of, it's said to go underneath. In effect, his burial chamber is underneath the tomb of Hatshepsut. So could well be a relationship between them. So that's very, very interesting in its own right. And lots of people have speculated about the ins and outs of that. But the thing that we're going to focus on, if I show the image, is this in his tomb. He has several different tombs, but this is the grandest of the tombs. As he got more and more powerful and wealthy and respected through his life, he built other tombs. So at least two of them you can visit. On the ceiling of his tomb is this very, very remarkable image of the sky in the form of a star map. So it's not just symbolic. It looks very, very technical, and there's lots of different pieces of knowledge in this map. And I think it would be fair to say that this is probably the one of the most significant technical drawings or star maps to have survived, most important technical pieces of information to survive from the ancient world, and it's buried in this roof of this temple, which you can't even visit, but luckily it has been very well studied and transcribed, and we've got the benefit of the drawings. And there's lots and lots of things we can talk about this thing in its own right, but the only thing we're concentrating on is that because this is such unfamiliar to idea, is that it describes the decans, or it gives a table of the decans. And the Senenmut tomb is the first in a particular sequence of decans, therefore it's called the Senenmut family of decans. So using the same sources, later tombs and monuments and manuscripts and all the rest follow it in with his sequence. So the decans, as you know, as I've mentioned, are 36 objects in the night sky. They're not all visible at once. They're on a kind of sequence throughout the year, but there are 36 of them. That's the 36 decans, and there are some other odd bits and pieces with them. The names of those decans vary from, and they're grouped according to different families. So this is the Senenmut version of the decans, if you like. There are other versions of the decans in existence, but we're not going to complicate it too much. This is probably the most widely used and famous of them by the Egyptians. And so you can trace the origins, and that's going to be important. So even that takes a while to absorb, right? And kind of, you know, you've got this drawing and the images of the decans. Maybe I'll highlight on the video itself the kind of the bit that's describing the decans. The thing that I wanted to draw your attention to and think about, because we talked about the decans as this sequence as a demonic calendar. Well, the descriptions of the decans in the first Senenmut thing are not particularly, they're basically their names of gods and all the rest of it, but the same sequence gets changed a little bit later on. So this is the 18th dynasty, and Hatshepsut and Tutankhamun and all the Akhenaten, all these very, very famous kings and queens of Egypt. So, you know, such a very, very creative moment. As I say, I've shown it in a slide. He's this fascinating scientist and vizier. And as I say, his decans are names of gods and goddesses taken from the well-known sequence or pantheon of gods that we know of from ancient Egypt. Therefore, they're often called Isis and Osiris and Hathor are all there, plus a few other lesser-known gods. And this is quite important. This sequence, including the god set, this sequence of gods, you might relate them, the same sequence of gods is also related to parts of the body, which is another interesting aspect. So thus far, it's names of gods and goddesses. I should say that you can't, when we're sort of looking for demons, demonology in ancient Egypt, there isn't a really impermeable layer between gods and demons. Certain gods, especially what we might call the minor gods, so how do we know they're minor? You know, it might just be an accident of discovery. They can also have this demonic aspect to them, or violent aspect, if you like, or even the goddess Isis can be, even Osiris in a way, can be demonic, and there actually are spells and amulets to drive them away, right, if they come in their demonic form. So there was a later belief that all the Egyptian gods were originally demons, but some of them get less demonic or non-demonic given time, but it's still, the signs of their early history are always still there. And some gods and goddesses never quite make the transference to the kind of totally benign realm, and Sety is usually an example of that. So why would we say that is there anything more than that would say that they were demons? Obviously there are these strange composite entities that we see all over the Egyptian tradition, you know, these kind of entities with serpent legs and without a head, or with kind of strange sort of things. I can give you a few examples of those, and we'll see more in a minute. But the pivotal moment in this whole process seems to take place in this mortuary temple, not in ancient Thebes or Waset, to give it its Egyptian name, but actually in Abydos, which is another important, probably one of the oldest of the sacred centers in Egypt, an enormous complex of different tombs and from all sorts of periods and prehistory and all the rest. But of course, you might guess we're going to talk about the Osirion. The Osirion is this very mysterious buried structure that is somehow related to the mortuary temple of Sety I. The temple itself is one of the masterpieces of the ancient world, and buried underneath it is this or would have been buried underneath it. Most of it has been exposed now, but it's still beneath, almost touching the water table, and quite deeply excavated. This is incredible structure that is also incredibly important to astronomy, and as one would expect, to the goddess Newt, or Newt. It has a whole sort of, I don't know if you can call it a sanctuary, an assemblage, a thing, a kind of special sealed box, a black box, if you like an enormous coffin, in fact, monstrous, colossal coffin made of stone. And on the walls of this are several significant texts connected with the goddess Newt, which wouldn't surprise. It comes up over and over again in this type of astronomy and this magic of the sky, which we're exploring in one way or another. So you wouldn't be surprised that she is there. But in this same monument, which again we've explored many times, as people do, because it's full of so many important magical pieces of information. It is a magical object in its own right. We say that now, and this was how it was viewed in the ancient world as well. I'll show a few of my photographs, because I was lucky enough to go there, of the site, which again, I think one of the, or several of the podcasts have explored Osiris, the Osirion rather, as it's called, in the past. And I'll kind of refer you to those, because it is definitely worth getting to grips with. But for us now, it was very, very interesting that also on the walls, as we would expect with all these astronomical texts, is a list of the decans. And these decans also follow the same family. They're also part of the same earlier family of decans, have similar names, but they're no longer take on the names of gods. They have a different sort of description, which is much, even though there are no images of these entities that it's describing, the descriptions themselves are fairly demonic. I think you'd have to agree. And then this is in a way, you might say this is another family of decans now. And this is known as the Sety, or the Settian family, not Settian. Remind you, this is the monument of Sety I, the father of Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great as well. And so the set of decans here, because it's a sort of variation, because it's a slightly different version, it's usually thought of as a different family of decans, a new family, if you like. And one of the most interesting things about this, I suppose you think it was no coincidence given the name Set and all the rest, is that unlike the earlier Senenmut family, the first family of decans, these ones have dispensed of the names of the gods, and they now are more clearly described as demons. All these monstrous entities, perhaps if I go into that a little bit more, it will be clearer why that is. So this is particularly, so that not only is it interesting that this decanal system, this more demonic system, comes into the world, and this is still a long time ago, I hasten to add, this is still about 1500, no, so it's 1350 before the Common Era, it's still a long time ago, that these are of interest to us because of this demonic aspect that they have. And so this whole, and the coincidence that they kind of emerge. I mean, it may be that people might find other versions of these. There aren't that many monuments that have survived. There are about 30, I think about 50 different examples, but a lot of them are very fragmentary. But yeah, there's some good examples. But let's assume that this change in religious sentiment to a more demonic frame of mind seems to first emerge in this monument of Sety I, whose name tells us that he was somehow connected with the cult of Set in the ancient world because of this family name. That was his family deity, if you like. So Sety I is he of Set, and so it's some sort of homage to his family tradition. And coincidentally, if it's not completely in your face, but when you know these technical things, you discover that there's this demonic sort of innovation, if you like, renaissance that takes place in the Osirians, which is another reason why it's incredibly interesting to us as people who are using this sequence to time our rituals, as to think about them. Also, these decans are sort of more related to the lunar solar year. So it keeps the lunar magic, the lunar tradition within Egypt is the most ancient element of it. But for a while, it's from the time of the building of the first pyramid, it went into a kind of became more of a priestly thing. It wasn't something that was used in everyday life, apparently, as much as we would expect. But it's still carried on as a sort of technical tradition. So interestingly, the Osirian uses these more lunar solar year, the cycles of the, which means the cycles of the moon, but over the course of a solar year, mapped over that. There are actually more than 36 decans. There are 56. These could be because there are duplicates are given, or it could be there's some technical other use for them as a sort of epicycle in some way. As I say, the names of the gods have mostly disappeared, and it's almost as if the god Set has taken over, and what we see is that the decans are sort of recognized or made his companions. Set is said to have a number of companions, sometimes said to be 72, 2 times 36, which is depending on which point of view you come from, you either think of them as his companions, or if you don't like them very much, you think of them as his confederates in some way, slightly put down. So as I say, the Osirian shows them only in name, but with long descriptions, but no pictures. But there will be pictures. At some point, people are going to restore the pictures, and you have to wait until you see other monuments, which are usually from later times, from the Greek times, which for some weird perspective, even though it's later, they kind of go through this period of reviving, of conservation of very, very old ideas. So often the newest temples, and by paradox, have the oldest ideas in them, which is useful from our point of view. That obviously some people might dispute that, but it seems to be the case. It might be that it was their last gasp. They thought they better write down in stone the really important things before the money ran out, essentially, and the religion was suppressed, and there wasn't the wherewithal to record this information, which is in fact what happened. So by the late period we mentioned before, the three periods, there's the Archaic period, there's this sort of middle period around Ramesses and Sety I, and then there's the late period when the Greeks and Nubians as well are kind of ruling Egypt. So by this late period, the Ptolemaic period, they have definitely acquired, these decans, full-blown images, which, even though they look different, you can tell from the descriptions are connected, just a continuation of the tradition from the Osirion. So that somebody has taken the Decan list from the Osirion, and in the new temple they've added the images. And we'll show some images. A good example is the Temple of Esna, which is actually a temple dedicated to various goddesses, the goddess Heka of magic, incidentally, and Neith. As recently, Esna has, well, not over the last decade, I think they've been cleaning the ceiling, and these images have really come to life. And you can say there's a very, very large class of Egyptian supernatural entities we might call demons, or sometimes people call them demon things or demon-like things. Again, because of the way, because even in the modern times, it's expensive to reproduce images from things like, the coffin texts or various ancient texts. A lot of publications of books, ancient Egyptian books, left out the pictures, so people have the idea that there are no images, which is just an accident. But actually, there was a big conference a few years ago called about demon things at Swansea University, and we had lots of different versions of discussions about this particular class of entity, of which there are many, many hundred apparently. So you could say, why this sudden change, or was it a big change, or was it some sort of parallel tradition? But from then on, we can talk about the Decans as having this demonic aspect to them. And I'll show you some things. The first of the Decans, it's always good to know the first, the beginning and the middle and end of something to kind of put the whole thing together. The first of the Decans, you could say, can stand for the whole sequence. So, especially in spell making and everything, the appearance of the first Decan, once you know what that is, can sort of act as a seed for the entire sequence, and that's certainly the case. The most well-known of probably all the kind of, or certainly one of the most well-known of the asterisms from ancient Egypt would be the dog star Sothis or Sobdu, and not surprisingly the constellation Sothis, which has a cycle as well. It's not always visible in the sky, and it plays this role, of course, as a sort of herald of Osiris rising from the dead and all this kind of stuff. But certainly it's also the name of the first of the Decans. It's the first of the sequence, more or less. Depending on what time you're looking at, because obviously with any of these complex systems, the first star in the sky may have slipped back a little bit, and that's certainly the case. There's another Decan which also you can either make it the last of the last one in the sequence or the first one in the sequence, and this is an incredibly significant Decan, which is known as Senenmut, and this one has a very interesting story to tell in its own right, and it tells us a lot about how these things were used in magic, not just to tell the time, but as this thing of kind of a piece of image magic, which is so central to the way the Egyptians did the thing, that you can take one of these images and you can, in a sense, it assumes it's almost like the first word of a spell. Once you're familiar with the spell, the first word of the spell or the first image in the sequence kind of is all you need. It kind of unpacks itself in a way, which is a very interesting. It's in here, this fractal, it's almost like the whole magic is inherent in the first image. So there's a very interesting story, and people obviously use this image as the first decan as a kind of a magical timer in amulets and all the rest. So I'll kind of show you an image from this, again, very, very interesting sequence of magical objects known as the magical gems, of which there are many, many thousands of them in various museums around the world. They're quite small, and there's a database, but they're quite small objects, but they're kind of packed with interesting magical ideas and techniques and all the rest, fascinating things. Anyway, there are several of these. Here's just one of them that if I describe it and then kind of, you know, maybe show you the drawing and this thing as well. It has an image of the decan on it of Senenmut rather than Sothis. But on one side of this little gem, and these are tiny little things, there are sometimes experts can't even work out how anybody could have ever made this thing. It's funny, people talk about the mysteries of building the pyramids because they're so big and all this other, but also how do you make these really, really small objects, which are so small, where you think when you start grinding away at it, you'd have to do it all by muscle memory. You wouldn't actually be able to see anything, because I don't think they had any little microscopes or anything like that. So they did it by touch, and they drew this little quite complicated magical image connected with the decans on it. And it's a composite figure, which you might think of as demonic, called Canubis, who is a popular entity in magical spells in the kind of Roman period. I would say this is kind of quite demonic form. He has a serpent's body with a curly tail, and he has this lion's head. So this looks pretty strange. Out of the head, he's got this, either he's got this crown, or you could think of these rays of energy, of which, if you count, there are 12, which is obviously a significant number in terms of 12, you know, the 12 months and all this sort of stuff, just put it that way. So this is magically potent supernatural entity with using a lot of spells. This might be mounted on a ring or maybe a sort of amulet, or just kept as it was. Nobody's completely sure, because these things obviously may fall out of their settings and end up in the drains or whatever, which is often the way that people find these. People go to the bathhouse and their expensive ring, they forget to take it off, and it kind of goes down the plug hole. So we turn it over on the other side, and this tiny little thing is a symbol of the decan Senenmut, which is, this is what I mean by demonic images. It's a serpent balancing on its tail, so rearing up and balancing on its tail, which also is quite a strange thing. So it's not depicted as lying on the ground, it's depicted as vertical. And you could tell this from other images. And then across its body are 3 other smaller serpents. And this makes quite a complex image of the tail balancing serpent with 3 smaller serpents. And that is the sign, an image that I was mentioning from the Osirion and from the Temple of Esna, of the first of the decans, in one way of looking at it, which is known as Senenmut. So getting an idea then how these things are used, this sort of, we quote them in a way. You kind of make some sort of reference to their existence. So, as I say, looking again at that entire sequence of decans, which by now has been revolving round and round in my background, so maybe you'll get an idea. It's obviously going faster than it would if it was. There's almost like a whole year sequence in about 10 minutes. If you choose which one you're going to say is first. It's going to be Sothis or Senenmut. You find that in the sky. You just need one more to draw a line across the sky. So you need to know one that's in the middle, really. It's pointless having one that's at the beginning and end, because they're going to be so close to each other. It's not going to show you where the rest of them are. So whichever one you choose, you want something about number 16 or 15 or 6, about halfway along in the sequence. And that number 16, which is just under halfway, is a decan, very, very interesting decan called Heri Ib Wear. Heri, some people take the name Heri Shestar, Master of Secrets. Heri meaning master, which is also an epithet of the god Anubis. He's Master of Secrets as well, which is why it's a popular magical name in the current times. So we've got the word master. Ib is another interesting word in the Egyptian language. It's not so unfamiliar, which meaning the heart. And we are this kind of ship. So essentially, it means the one at the middle of the ship, or someone standing in the middle of the ship, or perhaps the master, the person who's running the ship. Either way, all those things work. And this is the name of a particular constellation, which is being identified as the boat or the ship. And if you remember, we started this talking about Jake Stratton-Kent's speculation about the boat and the Argo, the ship. So coincidentally, this is it's on its journey through the decans. Is the ship. We're following the ship through the sequence, and this is all sorts of resonances. If you by now know anything about Egyptian ideology and ideas, that the idea of the ship taking us on some sort of journey through the ship, through the stars, the starships, if you like. It is an incredibly important concept and way of viewing the way you are. So finding the ship that's on this kind of channel or this sequence of stars is incredibly important, and that's been identified. I think I said earlier that in the modern times, this is part of the constellation known as Libra. And if you look at the constellation Libra, it does look like a ship. You could either say it's upside down, or maybe it's sailing at a particular angle on the celestial waterway. So there you go. You've got the two fixed points then on the decanal point, and we can join the lines between them, and we can find the entire decanal belt in the sky. Which is incredibly important. Whether you're actually going to use this or just knowing that this is there, maybe that's enough. You just have to know that this thing is there. Who is the master is a question. I did say Anubis is sometimes known as the master. In this case, for all sorts of reasons, given that the original, this constellation was also known in the earlier sequence of decans of Senenmut, and as we know from that, he kind of gave them, allocated particular Egyptian gods to them, and coincidentally, or perhaps it isn't a coincidence, the god Set is allocated to this particular constellation. So it's the master could well be Set. It could be Set and Anubis in a way, because from another piece of mythology, there's a kind of relationship between the two of them, and one can turn into the other by removing their skin. So Set is, there we go, is associated with this particular Deccan master in the boat, which again is interesting that he's thought to be leading a particular group of demonic beings through the sky along the demonic belt. So very interesting concept. Hopefully there. In the Osirion, this particular constellation as well is described, has another form, right? It's described in a slightly different way, which is, you know, one of the complex things about this. There isn't one standard view. There are lots of different families of these entities, these stars, and each family tells us something different about the same star. You know, that's probably why they exist. She is an unnamed lion-headed goddess who wears a crown with the famous crown with the serpent coming out of it, which is a nice connection as well, because it's been said by several scholars that this image of the serpent, we've already talked about serpents rising from the forehead or rising from the top of the head and resting on the forehead or on the front of the head, is very, very similar to something that in later times was known as Kundalini. And even Egyptian scholars use the word for it. There's something to do with that, and there's a whole mystery, which again I've discussed elsewhere or will discuss elsewhere. There's only so much you can mention to do with this serpent power in the body and how it is manifested in the Egyptian tradition, not just the Indian one, but the Egyptians had their own serpent cult, Ophidian cult, if you like, and hence serpent imagery really does abound within Egyptian iconography, and that's because it's referring to this very, very old cult to do with serpent lore. Well, I was talking this lion-headed goddess, as well as having the serpent crown with the fiery spitting serpents, and again, there's all sorts of magic connected with that, even in terms of having the lights that you use in the quarters of your room, your magical room, having some sort of serpent form to them. This is a very common thing to do with lamp magic within the Egyptian tradition and within the PGM as well. These sort of lights that have a certain form. She also carries a scepter, which is a kind of, I don't know what, like a club in a way, but a sort of power object. And also the Ankh sign, which is the most famous and most enduring of Egyptian symbols symbolizing life. So even with just one image, there's an awful lot of material coming together. So I'm thinking that probably that's a good point to finish this idea today, because there's another development of this that warrants a kind of lecture in its own right, which is when we talk about how the star clocks and this whole sequence of ideas, how they were used by the Egyptians, and how we can emulate them and use some of the same techniques, and how they painted these images. We talked about so far how they're painted on the ceilings of very high status tombs, sometimes within kind of special magical rooms within temples. But the other important way that these star clocks, the magic of the sky, is is utilized in Egyptian magic was to paint them on the side of individual coffins, and there are a number of examples of that, which initially might not sound that productive an idea, but it actually is fascinating and worth looking at in its own right, and has its own special mysteries which I kind of elucidate next time. And it also tells us something about how you actually use this sort of stuff within your magic, because it may have occurred to you a lot of these objects are maps of the night sky, but they're occurring in deep underground or in sealed structures buried under masonry or in coffins or whatever. How are you actually going to use them? Why are they there? How are we supposed to imagine that these things might have been put to use? And there is an answer to that. That was an answer for the Egyptians, but also is an answer for us, how we can pick up these ideas and also use them in the construction of spells. It gives you the actual dynamic of how a spell works or a piece of magic works one way or another. Anyway, but that's a great subject, which I'm going to reserve for next time. I'm looking for my notes to see whether that will be the last one. Give me an inch, I'll take a cubit or whatever it is. Anyway, so that might be the fourth part of this lecture. So we'll see how we go. Well, we're talking about the how to tell the time, but also these star clocks, the magic of the sky, but in connection with a more personal object, which is an individual person's coffin, some of which obviously were quite high status king's coffins, but an awful lot of the examples we got are I wouldn't say ordinary people necessarily, but presumably almost everybody did have it, something of some sort. But certainly a lot of kind of the middle classes, for want of a better word, the ordinary people would have had one of these objects. And of course the priests and the adepts would have had this kind of thing encoded into their, prepared for them. The preparation of this object would have been one of their tasks, initiatory tasks within the mysteries, I would have thought, is constructing and understanding what this is. Anyway, that's for next time. Hopefully I've kind of, what I wanted to demonstrate is this transference of these timekeeping object from sort of god forms to a much more overtly demonic, supernatural form, based as well on the cycle of the skies. That hence my validation of the idea that we can refer to this as a demonic calendar, a demonic sequence that has a huge resonance in later times in terms of things like the grimoires and their system of magical hours and all the rest. And of course, with people reviving Egyptian magic, using going back really to the Egyptian system and learning some surprising things. Anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you this next time when we talk about telling the time in your coffin kind of thing. So Senenmut, and thank you for listening.